Arthur drove deeper into the countryside, his headlights cutting through the thick fog that clung to the night like a suffocating shroud. The road had been empty for miles, not a single soul in sight. As he turned a corner, his eyes caught something standing alone in the middle of an abandoned field, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. A scarecrow, but not just any scarecrow. This one seemed unnervingly human. Its frame was twisted, too lifelike, with long, slender arms stretched wide, as if welcoming him into its eerie domain. The way the tattered clothes hung from its wooden limbs gave it a grotesque resemblance to a figure that had been left to decay, forgotten by time. Arthur parked his car by the edge of the field, curiosity overpowering the growing sense of dread gnawing at his gut. Stepping out, the cool night air hit him, thick with the scent of wet earth and something else. Something rotten, like old wood left to fester in the rain for too long. He walked toward the scarecrow, each step heavy, as if the ground itself wanted to hold him back. The closer he got, the more wrong everything felt. The once silent field now seemed alive, with a faint rustling, though there was no wind. The scarecrow's head, a burlap sack crudely stitched together, had buttons for eyes, two dark, hollow buttons that reflected no light. And yet, Arthur felt as though they were watching him. His breath quickened as he stopped a few feet from the scarecrow. There was something unnatural about it. The arms, made of jagged wooden branches, hung too low for comfort, almost like they were waiting to reach out and pull him in. The field was deathly silent now, the only sound his own breathing. His pulse pounded in his ears as his gaze remained locked on the scarecrow's face. And then it happened, a twitch. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but Arthur saw it. The head moved, just a fraction, as if acknowledging his presence. A chill ran down his spine, freezing him in place. His mind raced. Was it just a trick of the light? His heart screamed for him to turn back, to run, but his feet remained rooted to the ground, as if some unseen force held him there. The scarecrow's stillness was suffocating, and yet, deep inside, Arthur knew he wasn't alone. The fields around him seemed to close in, the shadows creeping closer, shifting in the corner of his vision. Something was here, something far older, far darker than the scarecrow itself. Suddenly, a gust of wind came from nowhere, whipping through the field. The crops swayed violently, and the scarecrow's arms moved with an unnatural fluidity, swaying as though it was alive. Arthur's throat tightened, fear coiling in his chest like a predator waiting to pounce. The buttons that served as eyes seemed to gleam in the moonlight now, staring directly into his soul, stripping away his sense of safety. There was no sound, no birds, no insects, not even the distant hum of the wind. Just silence, thick and oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Arthur's heart hammered as his body trembled. He couldn't take his eyes off the scarecrow. It stood there, looming over him, both a warning and a threat. And then, in the dead stillness, he heard it, a whisper, faint, like a breath of wind, but unmistakable. It came from the scarecrow, his name, Arthur. The blood drained from his face as cold panic seized him. How could he know his name? He staggered back, his body finally responding to the primal terror that screamed for him to flee. But as he turned to run, something caught his eye. At the base of the scarecrow, hidden in shadows, was something familiar. A small, dirt-stained toy, a wooden horse, broken and worn. He froze. It couldn't be. That was his, from when he was a child, lost long ago on his grandfather's farm. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This place, it wasn't just any field. It was the same field from his childhood nightmares. The scarecrow was the same. The whispers had returned. Arthur's legs finally obeyed, and he sprinted back to his car, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, as if the very ground beneath him wanted to drag him down. The scarecrow loomed in his mind, the shadows of the field swallowing him whole, as he slammed a car door shut and sped away. But as he looked in the rearview mirror, his blood ran cold. The scarecrow was gone, and yet, deep down, Arthur knew it wasn't over. The Scarecrow wasn't just a figure in the field. It was something far worse, and it would come for him again. Arthur's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped away from the abandoned field. His heart pounded in his chest, the eerie encounter with the Scarecrow replaying in his mind over and over. But the further he drove, the stronger a sensation began to claw at his memory. Something from long ago, a distant echo from his past that he had long buried. He could almost feel it now, just at the edge of his consciousness, as though the Scarecrow had not just disturbed his night, but something deep within him. As the road twisted through the countryside, flashes of his childhood returned, vivid and unsettling. He remembered summers spent at his grandfather's farm, an old, creaking property nestled at the end of an isolated dirt road, much like the one he had just left. His grandfather had always been a quiet man, reserved, with a strange obsession with the Scarecrow that stood in the center of his cornfield. It protects the crops, his grandfather used to say, though Arthur never understood from what. But there was something else, something far darker that his young mind couldn't quite grasp at the time. One summer evening, Arthur had wandered too close to the Scarecrow, driven by a mixture of childish curiosity and a strange pull he couldn't explain. He remembered how the sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to dance around the field. The Scarecrow, with its hollow eyes and worn-out clothing, loomed over him. But then, something strange happened. Arthur had found something at its base, a small, wooden toy horse, covered in dirt. It was the same toy his grandfather had carved for him when he was just a boy, but he remembered distinctly losing it one night, and despite searching everywhere, it was never found. Until now. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as the memory resurfaced. That toy, the very same toy he had just seen lying at the feet of the Scarecrow tonight. How could it be here? How could it have reappeared after all these years, in a field far from where he had grown up? A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as the pieces started to fit together, but with every piece that fell into place, the terror grew. He had forgotten, forced himself to forget what had happened that summer. But now the memories came rushing back, unstoppable and vivid. His grandfather had warned him never to go near the Scarecrow at night. He had told stories, strange ones, about how the Scarecrow wasn't just a protector of crops, but a keeper of something else, something much older, much more dangerous. Arthur had dismissed it as just another farm tale meant to scare children. But there was one night he couldn't forget, no matter how hard he tried. It was late, and Arthur had been awakened by a faint creaking sound, like old wood bending under pressure. He had looked out his window to see the Scarecrow, but it wasn't where it should have been. Instead, it was moving. Not fast, not with the grace of something alive, but slowly, methodically, its long arms dragging through the field. Arthur had frozen in fear as he watched the figure disappear into the darkness. When he told his grandfather the next morning, the old man's face had gone pale, his lips tightening into a thin line. "Never speak of it again," he had said, his voice a cold whisper, "and never go near it after dark." But Arthur had gone back. Curiosity had gotten the better of him. One night, he snuck out, clutching a flashlight, as he made his way through the tall corn. The closer he got, the more oppressive the air became, thick with an unnatural quiet. And there, at the base of the Scarecrow, he had found his toy horse, placed as if it had been waiting for him. That was the last clear memory he had of that summer. After that night, everything became a blur of nightmares and sleepless nights until his parents had taken him back to the city. Now, as Arthur's car sped through the empty road, the connection became undeniable. The Scarecrow he had encountered tonight wasn't just a coincidence. It was the same one, or at least, something that shared its malevolent essence. The toy horse was the link, a cruel reminder that whatever had haunted his childhood had never truly left him. The fear that gripped him then had returned, sharper, more real than ever. His grandfather's warnings echoed in his mind. He had never understood why the old man had been so adamant about the Scarecrow, why he had treated it with such reverence and fear. But now, the truth was becoming horrifyingly clear. Arthur's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as a realization struck him like a cold blade. his grandfather had known. The Scarecrow wasn't just a figure in the field. It was something far older, tied to the land and the family in ways Arthur had never comprehended. And now, it was coming for him. The toy horse had been the first sign, but there would be others. The Scarecrow wasn't just a memory from his past. It had been waiting, watching, and now it was ready to claim him. The road ahead blurred as Arthur's mind raced, fear coursing through his veins. The past he had buried had clawed its way back into his life, and he knew deep down that there was no escaping it. The Scarecrow's hollow eyes and twisted smile would haunt him once again, and this time there would be no waking from the nightmare. Arthur sat in the darkness, his car parked at the edge of the abandoned field, the engine now silent. His mind raced, but his body refused to move, paralyzed by the creeping dread that filled the air. The Scarecrow, that grotesque figure, still loomed in his thoughts. The buttons for eyes, the twisted posture, the whispers, all of it circled his mind like a predator stalking its prey. But what terrified him more than the Scarecrow itself was the truth he could no longer deny. The entity attached to the Scarecrow was not finished with him. It had come for him once before when he was a child, and now, after all these years, it was back, demanding something far worse than just his fear. Suddenly, Arthur felt a shift in the atmosphere around him, a cold that wasn't just from the night air, but from something deeper, something malevolent. The air grew thick, suffocating, as though the darkness itself was pressing in on him. His heart raced as a voice echoed in the back of his mind, a voice not his own, yet strangely familiar. It was the same voice he had heard as a child, when the Scarecrow moved for the first time. "You have something that belongs to me," the voice hissed, low and guttural, like wind scraping against old wood. Arthur's skin prickled with fear, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. His eyes scanned the darkness, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of the empty field and the oppressive weight of the night. The voice returned, clearer this time, as if it were speaking directly into his ear. "A choice must be made. What will you sacrifice?" Arthur's stomach twisted as he realized what the voice was asking. The Scarecrow, no, the entity that controlled it, wanted something from him, something precious, something it could feed on. But what? His mind reeled as possibilities raced through his thoughts, each one more terrifying than the last. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. Just a flash, barely perceptible, but enough to freeze his blood. The Scarecrow was no longer in the field. It was closer. So close, in fact, that Arthur could see its outline through the fog, standing just a few feet from his car, motionless but impossibly menacing. Panic surged through him, his hands trembling as they gripped the steering wheel. But the voice in his head demanded his attention again. "Choose, Arthur. What will you give?" Arthur's mind spiraled. He knew he couldn't outrun this. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just confined to the Scarecrow. It was part of him, tied to his past in ways he still couldn't fully understand. And now, it wanted more than his fear. It wanted a piece of him. The voice returned, colder and more insistent, weaving a terrible bargain into his thoughts. The first option hit him like a punch to the gut. He could sacrifice his most precious memory, the one thing that had kept him going through the darkest times of his life. It was a memory of his mother long gone, and the way she used to sing to him when he was scared as a child. The lullaby that had once made him feel safe. If he gave that up, it would be like erasing a part of himself, the last connection to the person who had made him feel truly loved. But if he didn't, what then? The second choice clawed at him with even greater horror. He could absorb the darkness, the very essence of the entity. It would mean taking a part of the Scarecrow's malevolence into himself, forever corrupting his soul. The thought sent chills down his spine. To become a vessel for that evil, to let it fester inside him, was unthinkable. And yet, the promise that came with it, power, control over the entity, was seductive. He could stop it from hurting anyone else, but at the cost of losing his humanity, of being consumed by the very thing he sought to defeat. The final option was the most terrifying of all. He could trade his sanity for freedom. The voice offered him an escape, He could walk away now, leave the Scarecrow and everything tied to it behind, but in doing so, he would lose himself. His mind would fracture, his grip on reality slipping until he could no longer distinguish between the real and the unreal. He would be free from the Scarecrow, yes, but trapped in a nightmare of his own making, lost forever in the corridors of his mind. Arthur's chest tightened as the weight of the decision bore down on him. The Scarecrow, still motionless, but undeniably closer, seemed to wait, its hollow eyes staring directly at him, anticipating his next move. Every option was a form of death, whether of his body, mind, or soul. The cold, hard truth was that there was no escape, only a choice in how he would be broken. The thought of losing his mother's memory, the one thing that had kept him whole all these years, nearly brought him to his knees. But the idea of letting that darkness inside him, of becoming like the Scarecrow, filled him with an even deeper terror. And to trade his sanity, could he live like that, knowing he had walked away but lost himself in the process? Time slowed as Arthur stared into the darkness, the whispering voice growing louder, more impatient. "Choose, Arthur. Choose now, or I will take everything." He felt the tears well in his eyes, the weight of the impossible decision suffocating him. In that moment, he realized that no matter what choice he made, a part of him would never leave this field. His hand reached for the door handle, trembling as he made his decision. Whatever the outcome, he would have to live with it. The Scarecrow's hollow eyes glimmered in the fog, as if it knew what was coming. The whisper turned into a low, guttural laugh, echoing through the empty night as Arthur made his choice, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Arthur stepped out of the car, his legs trembling as if they no longer belonged to him. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of an unseen presence, pressing down on him from all directions. Every breath felt labored, the cold night biting at his skin. But it wasn't the chill that set his teeth on edge. It was the silence. The kind of silence that filled the space between heartbeats, where the world seemed to pause, waiting for something terrible to happen. He scanned the field, his eyes straining in the dim light. Nothing moved, yet he felt watched, as if the shadows themselves had eyes. The Scarecrow was gone. Where it had once stood, looming over the field like a silent sentinel, there was now only an empty space. Arthur's mind raced, trying to comprehend what he had seen just moments before. It had been there. He was sure of it. But now, the stillness of the field mocked him, daring him to question his own sanity. His pulse quickened, and the pounding of his heart echoed in his ears, a relentless drumbeat in the suffocating quiet. And then, he heard it, a whisper, so faint that at first, he thought it was just the wind. But no, this was different. It was deliberate, creeping through the stillness like a snake slithering in the grass. It came from a field, from the same place where the Scarecrow had stood. His name, whispered on the wind, barely audible but unmistakable. Arthur. His breath caught in his throat. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, as if the very air around him had taken on a voice. He spun around, his eyes searching for the source, but all he could see were the shifting shadows cast by the moonlight. The Scarecrow was nowhere to be found, but something else lingered, something far more insidious. The crops, tall and dry, seemed to sway, though there was no breeze. It was as if the field itself was breathing, alive with a dark energy that pulsed through the night. Arthur's heart raced as the whisper came again, closer this time, wrapping around him like invisible hands. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, something that moved through the shadows, brushing against him, unseen but undeniably there. He could feel it now, the weight of its gaze pressing down on him, the cold touch of fear crawling up his spine. Every shadow seemed to shift and writhe, as if alive with malice. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, calling his name in a tone that was both seductive and terrifying. Arthur. The voice was almost familiar, but twisted, as though someone he once knew had been swallowed by the darkness and was now speaking from its depths. He wanted to run, to flee back to his car and drive far from this cursed place, but his legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place. Something was drawing him toward the field, toward the spot where the Scarecrow had vanished. The ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse, as if the earth itself had a heartbeat, slow and menacing. The shadows deepened around him, growing thicker, almost tangible, like black tendrils creeping across the ground. Arthur could barely see now, his vision clouded by the darkness that closed in from all sides. The whisper had become a low hum, filling his ears, drowning out his own thoughts. It was inside his head now, burrowing deep into his mind, feeding on his fear. He could feel it gnawing at the edges of his sanity, pulling him deeper into the abyss. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted. It was subtle at first, like the earth settling after a long day, but then it began to move in earnest. The soil beneath his feet seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen force. Arthur stumbled, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to regain his balance. He looked down and saw something that turned his blood to ice. The earth was not just moving, it was rising. From the depths of the soil, shapes began to form, dark and twisted, like figures made of shadow and dirt. They clawed their way out of the ground, their forms half human, half nightmare, with faces that seemed to melt into the darkness. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as the figures approached. Arthur staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The shapes moved toward him, slow but deliberate, their eyes, if they had eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. They were not alive, but they were not dead either. They were something in between, something far worse, bound to the field by the same dark force that controlled the Scarecrow. One of the figures reached out, its hand, or what passed for a hand, stretching toward Arthur. He could see its fingers long and thin, like roots digging into the earth. As it drew closer, the whisper returned, louder and more urgent. "Arthur, come with us." The voice was no longer seductive. It was commanding, demanding his submission. The shadows around him seemed to close in, the air thick with the stench of decay and something else, something far older and more malevolent. Arthur stumbled back, but there was nowhere to run. The figures were closing in from all sides, their bodies twisting and contorting as they moved. The whisper had become a scream now, echoing in his mind, drowning out everything else. His head throbbed, the pressure unbearable, as if the shadows themselves were trying to tear him apart from the inside. He could feel their cold breath on his neck, their hands brushing against his skin. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a single thought pierced through the terror: the Scarecrow. He turned toward the field, his eyes scanning the darkness, searching for the twisted figure that had started it all. And then, he saw it, standing at the edge of the field, its arms outstretched, its hollow eyes gleaming in moonlight. The Scarecrow was back, and it was watching. Arthur's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The Scarecrow wasn't just a puppet. It was the puppet master, controlling everything, pulling the strings of the shadows, the whispers, the figures crawling from the earth. It was all connected, all part of the same malevolent force that had haunted him since childhood. The whisper returned, softer now, almost gentle, but no less terrifying. "Arthur, it's time." The Scarecrow's eyes seemed to glow with a dark light, and the figures stopped moving, their hollow forms waiting for his next move. Arthur's legs trembled as the weight of the decision bore down on him once more. The shadows waited, the Scarecrow watched, and the night pressed in around him, suffocating, inescapable. Arthur's mind was unraveling. Every breath he took felt shallow, his body drenched in cold sweat as the oppressive night closed in around him. The Scarecrow loomed in the distance, its outline barely visible in the mist that clung to the field. But it wasn't the Scarecrow that terrified him now. It was the creeping sense that his reality was slipping away, unraveling like a frayed thread. Fear had taken hold of him, seeping into his thoughts, twisting everything he once knew into something grotesque and wrong. The whispers in the air had subsided, replaced by something far worse. silence. But this was no ordinary silence. It was the kind that hummed with anticipation, like the pause before a predator strikes. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse loud in his ears. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, the world around him began to distort. The fields, the sky, the distant trees, everything seemed to bend and warp as if viewed through a cracked lens. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the distortion remained, growing more severe with each passing second. His eyes darted to the ground beneath his feet, and that's when he saw it. His shadow. Except it wasn't his. The silhouette stretched unnaturally long across the ground, shifting as though it had a mind of its own. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as the shadow began to twist, contorting into shapes that defied explanation, taking on forms that weren't human. It danced at the edge of his vision, moving with a liquid grace, teasing his mind with the impossible. Arthur blinked again, harder this time. But when his eyes reopened, he realized with mounting horror that it wasn't just his shadow that had changed. The field around him, once a familiar stretch of abandoned farmland, had transformed. The crops, tall and dead, seemed to sway without wind, whispering secrets he couldn't understand. But worse were the figures, faint outlines moving within the stalks, just beyond his line of sight. He could feel their eyes on him, unseen yet undeniable, like cold fingers brushing the back of his neck. Every time he turned to face them, they vanished, slipping back into the dark recesses of his mind. The fear gripped him tighter, gnawing at his sanity. His vision blurred, and his surroundings seemed to breathe, alive, pulsating, like something far beyond human comprehension was watching, waiting for him to falter. And then came the hallucinations. It started with a voice, soft at first, almost like his mother's, gentle, familiar. But as the voice grew louder, more insistent, it became twisted, warped with a malicious intent. "Arthur, why did you leave me?" The voice asked, accusing, as if he had done something unforgivable. Arthur's heart raced as he clutched his head, squeezing his eyes shut, trying to block out the sounds, but they only grew louder, sharper. When he opened his eyes again, he saw her, his mother, standing in the middle of the field. But she wasn't right. Her face, once kind and warm, was distorted into a grotesque mask of decay. Her skin hung loosely, sagging and gray, her eyes hollow pits of darkness. "You left me, Arthur," she whispered, her voice cracking with unnatural venom. "Why didn't you save me?" Arthur staggered back, his mind rebelling against the image in front of him. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the longer he stared, the more the fear twisted his perception, making the impossible seem all too real. His mother stepped closer, her body twitching unnaturally, her hands outstretched. "Come to me, Arthur. Come home." The words were a command now, her voice laced with dark seduction. Terror shot through him like electricity. This wasn't his mother. It was something using her image, feeding off his deepest fears, his guilt, twisting his mind to break him. The field around him seemed to close in, the mist thickening, pressing against him from all sides. The figures in the shadows grew bolder now, stepping closer, their forms indistinct but undeniably malevolent. Arthur could hear them breathing, could feel the cold air shift as they moved nearer, drawn to his fear like moths to a flame. His vision blurred again, and when he blinked, the world around him had shifted once more. The sky above was wrong. The stars, usually distant pinpricks of light, now burned like watchful eyes, glaring down at him with malicious intent. The ground beneath him seemed to writhe, moving like a living thing, each step unsteady, as though he was walking on something that wanted to pull him under. He could feel the presence of the Scarecrow, still watching from the edge of the field, though it hadn't moved. Or had it? Arthur's heart pounded in his chest, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He knew what was happening. The fear was consuming him, blurring the lines between what was real and what was a figment of his fractured mind. The entity that haunted the Scarecrow wasn't just a physical threat. It was a psychological one. It was breaking him down, piece by piece, using his own mind against him. Every fear, every insecurity, every buried guilt was being dragged to the surface, twisted into something monstrous. And then came the final temptation. In the midst of the chaos, Arthur felt a pull, a seductive whisper that promised release. If he just gave in, if he let go of the fight, he wouldn't have to endure this torment any longer. The fear would end. The voice, now deep and resonant, echoed in his mind, offering him the sweet relief of surrender. You don't have to fight, Arthur. You've been running for so long. Just let go. Let me in. The temptation was overwhelming. Arthur's body ached, his mind frayed at the edges, ready to snap. He could feel the entity's presence closing in on him, ready to claim him, to pull him into the abyss. The darkness was thick and suffocating, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Let go, Arthur. I can take the pain away. I can make it all disappear. Arthur's hands trembled, his knees buckling under the weight of it all. His mind screamed for him to resist, to fight back, but the terror was too great, the pull too strong. His fear, the guilt, the twisted memories, it was all too much. And for a moment, just a fleeting second, he considered it. He considered giving in, letting the darkness take him, letting it consume him whole. The promise of peace, of freedom from the nightmare, was almost too tempting to resist. But then, somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance flickered. A small, fragile piece of himself that refused to let go. Arthur gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand, forcing his mind to focus. He wouldn't let the fear win. Not yet. Not tonight. Arthur stumbled forward, his breath ragged, his mind still reeling from the onslaught of visions and the suffocating grip of fear. The night had become a living nightmare, a twisted reflection of his deepest anxieties. But now, as the oppressive darkness wrapped around him like a shroud, something shifted. The whispers stopped. The figures in the shadows retreated. And in the sudden, unnatural silence, Arthur knew the entity was near, watching, waiting for him to face it. A heavy stillness hung in the air, thick and unmoving, as Arthur's eyes were drawn to the field's edge, where the Scarecrow stood once again. But now it was different. Its once static form seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its body no longer a mere figure of wood and straw, but something more alive. Its hollow, button eyes gleamed with a faint light, not reflecting the moon, but glowing from within, like two dark embers. The Scarecrow's arms, long and jagged, were no longer stiff. They hung loosely, swaying ever so slightly, as if waiting for Arthur to make his move. The realization hit Arthur like a cold wave. This wasn't just a Scarecrow. It was the vessel for the entity, the force that had haunted him since childhood. And now, after all these years, it had come to claim what it believed was its due. The connection between them, forged in the forgotten memories of his youth, had finally reached its breaking point. He had run from it for too long, buried the truth too deeply. Now, it was time to face it. Arthur's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his past that could explain this, what his grandfather had warned him about, what the Scarecrow really was. He remembered the old stories, whispered late at night in the dim glow of the farmhouse lantern. Stories of an ancient force that lived in the land, older than the farm, older than the town itself. A being that could only be appeased with sacrifice, with offerings of pain and fear. His grandfather had always been vague, cryptic, but now the pieces fit together. The Scarecrow was not just a guardian. It was a conduit, a gateway for something much older, much darker. His eyes locked onto the Scarecrow, and in that moment, he understood the truth. The entity wasn't just tied to the land, it was tied to him. Arthur had been marked from the moment he first encountered it as a child, the night he had wandered too close to the Scarecrow and found the wooden toy horse. That was the moment it had chosen him, the moment the cycle began. His grandfather must have known, but instead of protecting him, he had passed the burden on, leaving Arthur to face the darkness alone. The Scarecrow's head tilted slightly, a grotesque mockery of curiosity, as if it could sense Arthur's realization. The air around it seemed to ripple, bending reality like a heat wave distorting the horizon. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with a presence, a weight that pressed into Arthur's mind, filling it with dark whispers and fragmented memories. "You were always mine," the entity said, its voice a deep, guttural echo that resonated in his bones. "From the moment you touched the earth, you belonged to me." Arthur's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to keep his sanity intact. He wanted to scream, to run, but he knew there was no escaping this. Not anymore. The entity had waited too long, played with his mind, toyed with his fears. Now, it was done with games. It wanted to claim him, to consume him whole, body and soul. But as the darkness pressed in, Arthur felt something stir deep within him. A flicker of defiance, of strength he didn't know he had. He wasn't a scared child anymore. He wasn't helpless. Whatever this entity was, whatever power it had over him, he refused to give in. Not yet. "You're not taking me," Arthur growled, his voice shaking but filled with determination. The Scarecrow's eyes flared brighter for a moment, as if amused by his resistance. The ground beneath Arthur's feet trembled slightly, a subtle reminder of the power the entity held over this place. The field was alive with its presence, the very soil imbued with the malevolent force that had haunted his family for generations. Arthur took a step forward, his body trembling with both fear and adrenaline. The Scarecrow's form shifted subtly, as if it was preparing to move, to strike. But Arthur didn't stop. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on the dark, glowing buttons that served as the Scarecrow's eyes. "I'm not yours," he spat through gritted teeth. The entity's voice returned, colder now, more menacing. "You cannot deny me, Arthur. You are bound to this place, to me." Arthur's mind raced. He had no weapon, no plan, but deep down, he knew that the entity's power didn't come from the land or the Scarecrow. It came from the fear it inspired. It had fed on his fear for years, growing stronger with every nightmare, every whispered memory. If he wanted to break free, he had to do the one thing he hadn't done since he was a child. He had to face it without fear. Taking a deep breath, Arthur stepped closer still, his heart hammering in his chest. The Scarecrow's form twitched, the shadows around it thickening, as if preparing to strike. But Arthur didn't back down. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," he whispered, more to himself than to the entity. "I'm not running." The air around him seemed to freeze, the oppressive weight of the entity's presence growing heavier, more suffocating. The Scarecrow's body jerked violently, its limbs twitching as if controlled by invisible strings. The ground beneath Arthur's feet began to crack, dark fissures spreading outward from where he stood, as if the very earth was reacting to his defiance. For a moment, everything was still, and then, with a deafening roar, the Scarecrow lunged. Its long, jagged arms reached out, moving with impossible speed as it closed the distance between them. Arthur stood his ground, his eyes locked on the glowing embers of its eyes, refusing to give in to the terror that threatened to consume him. The impact never came. The Scarecrow stopped just inches from his face, its wooden arms frozen in midair, trembling as if held back by some invisible force. Arthur felt it then, the fear draining away, leaving him lighter, more in control. The entity's power was weakening. It couldn't touch him, not anymore. With a guttural scream, the Scarecrow's body began to convulse, its form collapsing in on itself as the dark energy that had once filled it dissipated into the night. The shadows retreated, the ground stopped trembling, and the oppressive silence lifted. Arthur watched in stunned disbelief as the Scarecrow fell apart, its wooden limbs crumbling into dust, leaving nothing but an empty field in its wake. The connection was broken. Arthur had faced the entity, and for the first time in his life, he had won. But as he stood there, alone in the field, a deep sense of unease settled over him. The Scarecrow was gone, but the entity, the force that had haunted him, was still out there, waiting, watching. He had escaped its grasp. But for how long? Arthur stood in the desolate field, his chest heaving as he watched the Scarecrow collapse into dust, but the victory felt hollow. The air was too still, too quiet, like the moment before a storm strikes. Though the Scarecrow had crumbled, he could feel it. The presence hadn't left. It was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting, biding its time. The oppressive weight of the entity still pressed against him, thickening the air and twisting his perception of the world around him. The field no longer felt like just a field. It felt like a battleground, and Arthur knew the real fight was far from over. The silence was deafening. Arthur's breath came in shallow bursts as he turned in slow circles, scanning the empty field. He could sense the entity watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. His skin prickled with the knowledge that he wasn't alone. He never had been. The shadows around him flickered unnaturally, bending and warping like they had lives of their own, twisting into grotesque shapes that whispered on the edges of his vision. The Scarecrow had been a puppet, a mere vessel for something far darker and more ancient, and now that it was gone, the entity would no longer hide behind masks. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted, the earth groaning as if something deep below was awakening. The dark fissures that had cracked open earlier began to spread, spiderwebbing across the field as the air became thick with the stench of decay. Arthur stumbled back, his pulse racing. From the cracks in the earth, a black mist began to seep, swirling around his feet like a living thing, wrapping around him with an icy touch. The mist carried voices, soft at first, but then louder, more urgent, like a chorus of the damned, all calling out his name. Arthur. His heart pounded in his chest as the whispers grew louder, sharper, cutting through the night like knives. The mist thickened, rising up in tendrils that clawed at his legs, pulling him toward the center of the field. He tried to move, but his feet felt like they were sinking into the earth, the ground beneath him turning soft and yielding, like quicksand. Panic surged through him, but deep down, he knew this wasn't a fight he could run from. This was the moment, the final confrontation. Out of the swirling mist, something began to rise. At first, it was nothing more than a dark shape, a shadow among shadows, but as it emerged from the ground, it took on form, a towering figure draped in black, with long, twisted limbs that seemed to stretch impossibly high into the sky. Its face was obscured, but two burning red eyes pierced through the darkness, locking onto Arthur with an intensity that made his blood run cold. This was the entity, no longer hiding behind the Scarecrow, but revealing itself in its true, nightmarish form. The air crackled with dark energy as the entity spoke, its voice a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You cannot escape, Arthur," it growled, its words echoing through the field. "You were mine from the moment you stepped onto this cursed soil. I have waited for you, watched you, fed on your fear, and now you will give me what is owed." Arthur's mind raced as the entity loomed closer, its massive form blotting out the sky. The ground trembled with every step it took, as if the earth itself was bowing to its presence. He could feel the weight of its power pressing down on him, suffocating him with its sheer force. But this time, he refused to let the fear take hold. He had faced the Scarecrow, faced the darkest parts of himself, and now he would face this. "I'm not afraid of you," Arthur said through gritted teeth, though his voice wavered with the effort it took to stand his ground. The entity laughed, a low, rumbling sound that shook the very air. "You lie to yourself, Arthur," it hissed. "I can feel your fear. It has sustained me, nourished me for years. You cannot hide from me." The entity raised one long, twisted arm, and with a flick of its clawed hand, the ground beneath Arthur split wide open, the fissure yawning like a mouth ready to swallow him whole. He staggered back, his eyes widening as he saw what lay beneath the surface. An abyss, endless and black, filled with writhing shadows and lost souls, their faces contorted in eternal torment. The screams of the damned echoed up from the pit, filling the night with a sound so horrific that it rattled Arthur's bones. "You see, Arthur," the entity said, its voice dripping with malice. "This is your fate, to join the others who have tried and failed. You cannot fight me. You are nothing. Arthur's legs trembled, the sheer terror of what lay beneath threatening to pull him into the abyss. But he fought against the rising panic, clinging to the one thing that had kept him going all these years: defiance. He wasn't nothing. He had survived this long, faced his fears head-on, and he wouldn't give up now. With a surge of adrenaline, Arthur stood tall, his voice steady this time. I'm not yours. I was never yours. You fed on my fear, but you'll starve now. The entity roared, its red eyes flaring with anger, and the ground around Arthur cracked and buckled as the abyss began to pull at him. The mist swirled faster, wrapping around his legs, tugging him toward the edge. But Arthur dug in his heels, refusing to be dragged into the darkness. He felt the pull of the entity's power, the temptation to give in, to let it take him, but he fought it, every fiber of his being resisting. In the distance, a faint glow began to rise, just a flicker at first, but then brighter, pushing back the shadows. Arthur squinted through the darkness, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a farmhouse, his grandfather's old farmhouse, bathed in a warm, golden light. The memory of it was so vivid, so real, that for a moment, Arthur could almost smell the familiar scent of wood smoke and hear the creak of the porch swing. The entity hissed in fury as the light grew stronger, its form flickering, unstable. No, it roared, its voice shaking the ground. You cannot escape me. But Arthur knew what he had to do. The farmhouse wasn't just a memory. It was his strength, his connection to the life he had before the fear took over. It represented everything the entity couldn't touch. Drawing on that memory, Arthur took a deep breath and stepped toward the light. The mist recoiled, the shadows pulling back as the light grew brighter, enveloping him in its warmth. The ground beneath him steadied, the fissures closing as the entity screamed in rage, its form beginning to dissolve into the mist. You will not win, the entity shrieked, its red eyes burning one last time before they flickered out, leaving only darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The field was still. The mist was gone. Arthur stood alone, bathed in the soft glow of the farmhouse's light. The entity had been defeated, not by force, but by his refusal to give in to the fear. He had faced it, confronted the darkest parts of himself, and won. But as he stood there, the silence pressing in around him, Arthur knew this wasn't the end. The entity was gone, for now, but the darkness would always linger, waiting for the next moment of weakness. He had survived, but he would never be truly free. As he turned to leave the field, the last remnants of the mist swirled at his feet, whispering softly, I'll be waiting, Arthur. I'll always be waiting. Arthur left the field behind him, but the weight of the night still clung to his every step. The farmhouse that had glowed so warmly in his mind was gone, replaced once more by the cold emptiness of the abandoned fields. The Scarecrow had crumbled to dust, and the entity was defeated. At least, that's what he told himself. But as he walked back toward his car, his feet crunching over the brittle remains of dead crops, a chill ran down his spine. Something wasn't right. The air still felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike, and the silence, it wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. The headlights of his car came into view, cutting through the mist that still clung stubbornly to the ground. For a brief moment, Arthur allowed himself to believe it was over. He had faced the darkness, resisted the pull of fear, and escaped the entity's grasp. But as he reached for the door handle, a flicker of movement caught his eye, something small, something dark, shifting in the periphery of his vision. He froze, his hand inches from the handle, and slowly turned his head. There in the distance, at the far edge of the field where the Scarecrow had once stood, a shadow moved. It was faint, barely visible through the haze, but it was there. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The shape was human, tall, thin, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. It didn't move like a person, though. It swayed, almost lazily, as if it were being stirred by a wind that didn't exist. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest as he strained to see through the mist. It couldn't be. The Scarecrow was gone, destroyed. But there it was, looming in the distance, a silhouette against the gray night. And then, as if sensing his gaze, the figure shifted, turning toward him. Arthur's blood ran cold. The shape had no face, just a dark void where eyes should have been, but he could feel it watching him, just as it had in the field. Watching. Wait. A chill settled over him, deeper than the night air, colder than the fear he had faced in the final confrontation. The entity wasn't gone. Not really. It had been weakened, perhaps, but not destroyed. It lingered, hiding in the shadows, biding its time. Arthur could feel its presence like a splinter lodged deep in his mind, an invisible tether that tied him to this place, to the darkness that lived beneath the earth. It wasn't over. It would never be over. Arthur's hands trembled as he fumbled with the car door, his eyes never leaving the figure in the distance. It hadn't moved, but its presence filled the night, oppressive and heavy. He threw himself into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind him, but even the barrier of metal and glass did nothing to ease the sense of dread that clung to him. His fingers shook as he turned a key in the ignition, and the car roared to life. For a moment, the sound of the engine seemed to break the spell, the headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. But as Arthur glanced in the rearview mirror, his stomach dropped. In the reflection, just beyond the reach of the car's red taillights, the shadow moved again, closer this time. Slowly, deliberately, it began to walk toward the car, its limbs moving with an unnatural, jerky grace. Arthur's breath hitched as he gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The figure, no, the entity, wasn't finished with him. It was still there, lurking at the edges of his reality, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Without thinking, Arthur slammed his foot down on the accelerator, the car lurching forward as it sped down the narrow, empty road. The fields blurred by, but no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. Every glance in the rearview mirror revealed nothing but darkness, but Arthur could feel it. Just out of sight, just beyond the reach of the headlights. The entity was with him, its presence etched into the night like a stain that couldn't be washed away. The road twisted and turned, but Arthur barely registered the path ahead. His mind was consumed by the events of the night, by the knowledge that no matter how far he drove, no matter how far he ran, he could never truly escape. The entity was part of him now, woven into the fabric of his fears, his memories. He had defied it, yes, but that defiance had only delayed the inevitable. It would wait, it would watch, and one day, when his guard was down, it would return. The lights of the nearest town appeared in the distance, a flickering promise of safety, but Arthur knew better. He slowed the car as he entered the quiet streets. The dark houses standing silent and still, their windows like blank eyes staring out into the night. He pulled into the driveway of a small motel, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. He sat there for a long moment, the engine idling, his fingers still gripping the steering wheel. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline of the night still coursing through his veins. Finally, with a deep, shaky breath, Arthur turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. He stepped out of the car, his legs weak beneath him, and looked around the empty lot. Nothing moved. The night was still. But as he stood there, the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. Slowly, reluctantly, he glanced over his shoulder, toward the road he had just traveled, toward the fields he had left behind. In the distance, barely visible in the faint light of the motel's neon sign, a shadow lingered at the edge of the lot. It was far away, but it was there, watching. Arthur's breath caught in his throat as the figure remained still for a moment, then slowly turned and disappeared into the night. He stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity. The darkness seemed to press in around him, the weight of the entity's presence still heavy in the air. It was gone for now, but Arthur knew that this wasn't the end. It would return, just as it had always returned. The terror, the fear, the shadows, they were part of him now. The entity had left its mark, and no matter how far he ran, no matter how much he tried to forget, the mystery would remain.